is attempting by executive order to embroil Pennsylvania in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. This in an effort to combat perceived climate change. Not only will RGGI raise energy bills for all Pennsylvanians, but is it really a solution in search of a problem? To learn more, we turn to Greg Wrightstone. Greg is author of the best-selling book, Inconvenient Facts, The Science Al Gore Doesn't Want You to Know. Greg, welcome back to Lincoln Radio Journal. Greg, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, this is one of those things. The left is really good about giving nice-sounding names to their policies, but then when you get to the policies, not so much. So before we get into discussing the pros and cons, mostly cons to this initiative, what is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative?
Yeah, it's a conglomeration of, right now it's 10 Northeast states. Pennsylvania's looking to join those. What they've done is establish a market, if you will, where electricity providers, and this Regional Greenhouse Initiative, it doesn't have to do with transportation or home emissions. It has to do with electricity generation. CO2 emissions is what they're trying to control with this. And so what the program does here is establish this market through which each of these electricity providers, it would be coal and natural gas in our state, not nuclear, because of course nuclear really doesn't provide any greenhouse gas emissions. So these electricity providers would have to go and purchase what are called emission allowances that would offset their CO2 emissions. Right now, Pennsylvania is emitting about 82 million, at least by 2016, the best I could find, latest data, emitted about 82 million tons of CO2 from these sectors. The current cost to buy from the market is $5.20 a ton. So these electricity emitters, the coal-fired plants, the natural gas-fired electricity generation sources, that would generate, well, actually it would cost them about $400 million, which is in line with what Governor Wolf in his proposal. He indicated that the state would receive somewhere between $280 and $400 million of revenue from the purchase of these allowances. So what you have here are electricity providers paying the government of Pennsylvania or some entity that's to be set up yet $400 million, $300 million, whatever it is, and those costs are not going to be eaten by the companies, but rather passed on to the consumers. So what that does then is drive up the cost for electricity generation by coal and natural gas-fired electricity generation source, and that in turn makes wind and solar and nuclear more competitive. And that's the goal, really, is to make fossil fuel-fired electricity generation much more expensive so the other sources can compete against it. In your lead-up, you're right. It's painful. It's onerous. Increased electricity costs is not going to do anybody any good except those receiving the beneficiaries from the money, and that would be probably increased subsidies for wind and solar. Most of that money they get will probably go to increased transportation and public transportation in Philadelphia, Harrisburg, and Pittsburgh. I think it's going to mainly, you can view it as a great transfer of wealth from counties like Elk County and Indiana County and Greene County to the metropolitan areas of Pennsylvania.
Let's break this down a little further here, Greg, because you've said a lot in that answer. And my first question to you is, this $400 million in revenue, this sounds like a tax that's being added. So how can the governor just unilaterally bind Pennsylvania to an agreement that is essentially going to be placing yet another tax on power generators, those that use fossil fuel?
Well, from what I can read, and I'm not a lawyer, and I don't even play one on the radio, but from what I can read, they're going to do this under they believe they have a constitutional mandate for clean air and clean water. So this would be under the auspices of the Department of Environmental Protection, just another protection to protect the people and provide the clean air and clean water that our Constitution says we have to provide. Sure sounds From what I can read, a lot of people are saying that they don't need legislative approval and that the legislature does not have veto power. It will have to go through a review process for comments, from my understanding. But again, it could well be that this is a thing that could be enacted without legislative approval. But that's time will tell. Maybe go to the Supreme Court of the state, and we know how that's worked out for those of us that believe in constitutional limitations of government. It hasn't worked out too well.
We are talking with Greg Wrightstone, who is author of Inconvenient Facts, and today we're talking about the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This is an agreement that Governor Tom Wolf is unilaterally imposing on Pennsylvania, as we've been discussing, attempting to bypass the General Assembly, which, Greg, I have to say, in recent years has not been very good at standing up for its own powers against this governor. But let's also then explore the whole premise of this, and that is that we have CO2 emissions that are damaging to the environment, are causing so-called climate change. Is this whole premise actually even accurate? Is this really a solution in search of a problem?
Hey, that's my line. You're right. You're allowed to borrow it because I like it a lot. Yeah, it is a solution in search for the problem. For the one thing, let's just take a look. The governor in his rollout, he looked at 2018 flooding and said, this is being caused by global warming. And I've taken a look at that, and 2018 it was record level of precipitation since they started keeping records back in the early 1900s. That is a fact. But I took a look at looking at the NOAA data, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration data, to look at the biggest storms. And those peaked in the 40s and 50s with a significant decline since. 2018 appears to be an anomaly if we look at precipitation. So he's just wrong about this increase in precipitation. And then he also talks about heat waves, which we know in Pennsylvania, the really, really worst of the heat waves occurred in the decade of the 30s, the Dust Bowl era. And it's not even close. The other thing we look at is what is the goal of this proposal? The goal is to change the temperature of the Earth. They want to do it by decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. If we did do this and we imposed this regulation and we got rid of 100% of the greenhouse gas CO2 emissions from electricity generation, what would that do to future temperatures? So I actually looked at data source, and this goes back to the National Center for Atmospheric Research. I took their database and their formula for calculating future warming from greenhouse gases, and I took a look at what that would mean, and what it would change if we reduced 100% of electricity's CO2 emissions. It would avert, now you ready for this, 1,000th of 1 degree Fahrenheit by the year 2050. That's it. 1,000th of 1 degree Fahrenheit by the year 2050 is what would be averted. So I'll ask you, Lowman, how many jobs is that worth? How many jobs lost is that worth?
Well, from my point of view, it would be none, but...
Right. Right, and you would be right. And this is it's too small to even measure. And this is what they're trying to do. This is their goal. They want to decrease temperature by 1,000th of 1 degree Fahrenheit in 30 years. Well, come on, man. It's crazy. And they haven't even looked at how are we going to replace this? They're going to replace it with what, wind and solar? We already saw last year that the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and bear in mind that the Pennsylvania Game Commission controls about 25% of the land that has potential industrial scale wind development. The Pennsylvania Game Commission voted unanimously to ban any wind projects because they thought it was too dangerous and impacted endangered species, and it was too dangerous for people to be around, and they banned it.
We have been talking with Greg Wrightstone. He is author of the book Inconvenient Facts. There's also a smartphone app. So, Greg, tell us a bit about the app, the book, and where folks can go to get both.
Yeah, the book is, and actually, Lowman, it was just in the last week, it was the #1 bestseller on Amazon in 3 categories. So it's been incredible. People are loving it. You can go to inconvenientfacts.com .xyz. You can click there. You can get $5 off. And the smartphone app is awesome. You can go to the App Store, Google Play Store, and just type in Inconvenient Facts. We're approaching 50,000 downloads of that.
The book is Inconvenient Facts, the science Al Gore doesn't want you to know. Greg Wrightstone has been with us. He is the author. You're going to want to check out the book, Inconvenient Facts, also the smartphone app. Greg, thank you for taking time to be with us.
Thank you, Lowman.
Is another big